Okay, thank you for the introduction, Imra, and thank you, Daniel, for giving an excellent talk that nicely leads into a lot of the issues I'll be talking about as well. How many people came to the launch event? Show of hands. Okay, so crowd sitting right in the middle there. And so some of what Daniel talked about probably seem familiar to you, and certainly some of the things I'm going to talk about will be a little familiar from some of the issues that Jamie Ward and Giles Hamilton Fletcher talked about last time. But I'll try and put some of my own spin on those things as well. The main crux of my talk is on sensory substitution and augmentation. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the aspects of the work that, like Daniel's research, is looking at how we can provide visual information to someone who has some limitations in their visual abilities, whether it could be profound blindness and they can't see anything at all, or have some varying degree of visual abilities. But it also has a lot to do with sensory augmentation as well. Because if you can translate any sort of information, be it visual or anything else, into something another sense can process, then really you have no limits on the sorts of things that you could allow a person to sense in a new way. And in a lot of ways, we like to think of it as sort of non-invasive biohacking. And I kind of like this term biohacking, usually because if you look up videos on biohacking, you might see some disturbing things that people do at home alone with different wires and things like that. But in this case, it's all non-invasive. So we're trying to take advantage of the ways the brain can rewire itself through experience. And ultimately, what we want to see is whether vision, in this case, can be induced or enhanced through the ears. And a lot of this work I'll be talking about involves a piece of software called The Voice that was invented by Peter Mayer, who's an engineer in the Netherlands. And I have a demo in the back that you can try, in addition to some sounds I'll present as we go through. So as Imra mentioned, I direct the Cross-Modal Cognition Lab at the University of Bath. I'm in the Department of Psychology, but I also have a sort of joint appointment in computer science. We have a Center for Digital Entertainment, where we're looking at ways we can not only make things entertaining to the visual sense, but through sound and through touch as well. My lab covers a lot of issues. I didn't put the species up here that Imra mentioned, because I do collaborate with people on things with zebrafish, bees, monkeys, apes, and so on. But we do things all the way from visual cognition, perceptual learning and memory, synesthesia, which Jamie Ward does a lot of work in, multisensory cognition in general, work on blindness and cognition, in particular how being congenitally visually impaired might change the structure and functioning of the brain, and spatial cognition, though I'll be focusing just on the sensory substitution and augmentation side of things here. And won't be able to go through a whole list of people who have contributed to this work. A lot of collaborators, postdocs in my lab, students, including one, Typhoon, who's in the back here, who will help me display things, and a number of research assistants who have helped out with this work. And the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council funding has helped with a lot of this as well. So how can vision be restored or provided in some way? Now, in this figure coming from a paper by Olivier Collignon and colleagues, is looking at, in the center, sort of the normal situation where, if you think about vision, we're normally receiving information through the normal organ, our eye. That information is going through a primary sensory pathway to the brain and getting processed at high levels until we somehow respond, maybe through motor movements, to whatever it is we're seeing. Now, if a person has damage, say, at the level of the eye, then the different alternatives that are available for restoring vision in some way would be either to alter that organ itself, restore it perhaps through some things like stem cell treatments that are being tried for certain conditions, or to try and do some of this biohacking, and to try and think of some other ways, either through something invasive, which is over on the right side here, thinking about invasive neuroprostheses, or something non-invasive like sensory substitution on the left-hand side. The main idea is that on the invasive side, you can either have implants that operate at the level of the eye, depending on the sort of damage that's there. So you can have epiretinal or subretinal implants that actually go into the retina. Or you can move all the way up to the brain and actually have implants in the visual cortex that provide visual information from a camera. On the non-invasive side, what we try to do is do something with the information that the person's unable to access. These different parts that we describe generally as visual information, and somehow simplify it, code it, and transduce it, as you heard in Daniel's talk, to another intact sense. And in particular, the ones I'll be mentioning more involve either transforming information into touch, which you can do via the hands, or in the example I have here, I show a tongue, and also through sound. So being able to take advantage of a person's hearing to provide that information. So the sort of intellectual grandparent for some of the things that Daniel's working on is going back to work by Paul Bacchiarita and colleagues in the 60s, where they initially wanted to take advantage of this idea of transforming visual information in a way that a person can perceive, in this case through touch. And so of course in the 60s, you'll see only some of the computer equipment they had that was required to do this. So you have this room, and they have all these different electrical items, wires hooked up to a camera, which is receiving the visual information, so sort of serving in place for the eye. Just dealing with a black and white image. So on the right, you'll see a person's face, just with white and black pixels representing it. And then the person using this old dental chair would feel all these little vibrotactile pins pressed on their back, representing what was in front of the camera. And nowadays, obviously, it'd probably be uncomfortable to carry around this dental chair if you wanted to use this in any mobile fashion. And so, sort of popular way to do this now, you'll see on the right here at the bottom is this small device that can go on your tongue, the tongue display unit. And there are devices as well still actually using chairs. We have some collaborators in Arizona who have set up different similar things following Paul Bacchiarita. So if you go into a situation where you're sitting in a chair, say for an interview, you could still use vibrotactile information being felt on your back. Now, at the core of this, we have an information processing challenge. And that problem comes up because vision potentially is providing a lot of information. And we tend to use it and think of it as being something that's very good for spatial acuity. So you can, just by looking around a room, have a good idea of where every face is in this room. And even if you have twice as many chairs in here, you can still probably pick out the face of a friend fairly easily. And in part, going back to some classic papers, it's been estimated that vision is able to process about 4.3 times 10 to the 6 bits per second. So that's a lot of information just every second that has to be processed, coming from all regions of the visual field. So why might you use touch as a reason, as a way, as a method for representing this visual information? Well, in part because the skin provides a nice spatial analog to the retina. So your retina is representing all this three-dimensional information in front of you in just a two-dimensional image. And so it makes sense that you should be able to represent that information somehow on the skin. You can somehow just sort of put a picture on the skin, on the tongue, if you will. But you do have the problem that the information processing capacity of the skin changes depending on where on the body you put it. So certainly the reason the tongue has become a popular destination is because it is more sensitive than, say, your lower back or the bottom of your foot or something like that. But still, when thinking about in terms of the information processing capability, some estimates again put out about 100 bits per second. And so you're going to have to simplify things a lot. And also, as Daniel mentioned in developing his device, is you have to think about the cost of things. So in order to have something that's able to make impressions on the skin, you have to have some hardware. You have to be able to build something that can do it. And so some of these reasons are why people, including Peter Mayer, who developed the voice, started thinking about developing an auditory system to represent visual information, to somehow sonify images. In part because it can be cheaper to do that. I mean, most people here have their smartphones. You probably have some earphones in your pocket, and you have a camera on your smartphone. And that pretty much gives you everything you need to deal with any sort of visual to auditory substitution. Our auditory system has high temporal acuity, so we can hear fine changes over time, which might be some way to map onto the spatial acuity of vision. In estimates of its information processing capacity, it's thought to be able to process 10 to the 4 bits per second. So it's higher than tactile, but still we're going to have to simplify things a lot from vision. But then the question is, well, how can we provide visual spatial information through sound? There's no direct, obvious mapping, or is there? So we're going to take a little diversion for a mini experiment here. And for this, there's 2 images up here. The one on the left has a lot of sort of soft curves. The one on the right has these spikes going on it. And each shape has a name. And so there's 2 names you can choose from, Kiki and Booba. So who thinks this object on the left, with the curves here, might be called Booba? Okay, does anyone think the spiky one should be Booba? Oh, good. There's a rebel. We need to have rebels. We can't all think the same, otherwise we'll never hack anything. Okay. But yeah, so over 90% of people in here, I think, raised their hand and said the spiky shape was Kiki. And across numbers and numbers of studies, you always find over 90% call it Kiki. Well, why is that? Well, let's look at another thing, and then we'll get to some of the whys of it. So you'll see there's an image here of 2 shapes. There's a little yellow diamond up at the top of the image, and at the bottom is a large black circle. I'm going to play 2 sounds. You can tell me which goes with which. Okay, so start with the second one. Which shape do you think that sound goes with? Does anyone think it goes with the yellow diamond? Where's the rebel? No. Okay. Even the rebel doesn't think so. Okay, so I'm guessing that everyone thinks this sound goes with that yellow diamond. Okay. Let's play that again because it drives people crazy. Okay. Yeah, so with this yellow diamond, you have this high-pitched sound. And across a number of studies, high-pitched sounds have been shown to be associated with or to correspond with high elevations, bright colors, small things, and angular shapes. The low pitch, this big black circle, low pitches have been found to match low elevations, dark colors, large things, and rounded shapes. And so bright colors also tend to go with loud sounds, dark colors also tend to go with quiet sounds. And so all of these come together as what are called cross-modal correspondences. So we have some way that our different senses have different features that correspond with one another. And these go across multiple modalities. You can find this also in taste, smell, touch. They're cross-cultural. They also seem to work in prelingual infants. And so it suggests there's some natural understanding. Something about how we're hardwired seems to give rise to a number of these correspondences between the senses. And so this suggests we have some sort of perceptual code we can use to try and translate information from something like vision to sound, or really any of these senses. There are all these correspondences we can take advantage of. So to get back to the issue of dealing with turning images into sound, what we're primarily trying to do is just thinking of this image as information, and perhaps a lot of information, as we discussed before. And what this image shows is a picture taken by someone who'll come up later again, Pranav Lal, when he went camping in the Himalayas. And so you have sort of this nice V made that goes across the whole image from mountains on either side, number of trees, rocks in the foreground, and a tent off to the right. Now we can break the image down into little parts. Because if you deal with the whole image, I think most people think of those high-level things. You know, where was the image taken, what's in it. But it's hard for computer vision models to just recognize what's in an image and to recognize what you want to know about the image. And so what we can at least do is break it down to all these little squares or pixels and think about the image information in each of those little squares. And so at the upper right-hand corner here, you have this little square. On the y-axis, for the spatial information, it's high. On the x-axis, it's to the right. And in terms of its luminosity, it's bright. For this pixel down over here at the left, it's low. In terms of the y-axis, it's left. On the x-axis, and its luminosity, it's dark. And so for a lot of this work, particularly with the voice, we're mostly dealing with grayscale. And so we're taking away the color information, though it has little features where you can have it tell you the color of things as well. A similar device, even as Daniel mentioned, can code for color with different sounds. But in this case, just thinking about the grayscale information. And so I mentioned we have this perceptual code we can take advantage of for the cross-modal correspondences. So that means we can now think of this pixel up at the right, the y-axis represented by a high pitch, the x-axis being represented by a right stereo pan. So if you hear something on the right, it'll be represented over there. And because it's a bright square, it could be loud. This pixel down here would be lower pitch because it's lower, be heard on the left on the x-axis, and relatively quiet because it's dark. Though for how the voice works, it dual codes the x-axis. So in order to turn all these pixels into sound, it scans across these columns from left to right every second or every 2 seconds, whatever speed you feel comfortable with. And so there's also this temporal feature as it scans from left to right. And so just to show this again, so all you have to do is you have to provide it with a camera input. Here are some spy sunglasses, which we have a pair of back in the corner. That provides the input. We have a small computer here that processes the image, turns it into sound, and plays it out to some headphones. And as I mentioned again, you just have pitch representing the y-axis, timing and stereo panning the x-axis, and the loudness is coded as how bright it is. So I'm going to play a couple sounds, see if you can recognize them. Anyone want to take a guess what that is?
They're from Pac-Man.
Pac-Man?
That's what it sounds like.
Sounds like it's from the game?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that when the ghost eats you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, it's an image though.
Is it that picture on the right?
I see a few people drawing it with their fingers. Yeah, so it's a diagonal line, like that. Play it one more time. Okay, here's another one. What do you think that is? See some of the fingers going again? So something at you. Any other guesses?
Can you play it one more time?
You have it pointed. That's a V. And actually telling apart a U and a V is very difficult. That takes some training. Just play that one more time. Okay, so just to give an example of something a little more complex, an article for the New Scientist, they were interested in Pranav Lal. So he's this congenitally blind computer programmer in India who uses the voice device, and he enjoys using it primarily for photography. He sees it as a nice way to sort of communicate with the sighted world in terms of sounds that he likes for the images he takes, but also as he's able to recognize what is in the image, he'll try and take nice photos like that picture of the Himalayas that you saw. Show a little video which also gives a bit of a demonstration of some of the features too. It's a bar high up, line lower down, one angled up, one angled down. It's another shot of the Himalayas, close to the campsite. It's interesting, this one actually sounds like water, and it's showing a picture of water. Picture of clouds. Another mountain scene. Pluto. He didn't take that picture of. This is an example of a thermal camera of a mouse there at the end. Again, just to sort of bring across the idea that this could be used for sensory augmentation rather than just sensory substitution. So what are our issues we have to deal with in using it? Well, certainly on one hand, we have certain technical acuity limits across different devices. And so here on the left, you see the voice is able to represent, at least in the version we're using, over 25,000 pixels. There's another device from Belgium, the PSVA, which obviously, as you can see, represents far fewer pixels, 60 in the periphery, 64 in the center, because they're trying to make it seem like having the retina and having a foveal region that's more overrepresented for wherever you're looking. There's the tongue display unit, if it could show things in grayscale. So usually it's just providing you a black or white information. And at the far right is the Argus 2 on the retinal implants. That version can show 60 pixels. Now, this is technical acuity, but how about human visual acuity as measured by an optician's test? So our lab and other labs have been testing it with a version of the letter chart that an optician has called the Snellen tumbling E. So instead of saying which letter it is, you say which way the E is facing. And what's important is you determine visual acuity, such as where a person has 20/20 vision or 6/6 vision in meters, by looking at how small they can still make out what the information is. And on the right side is just sort of a demonstration of what 20/200, which is often taken as the legal definition of blindness, might look like if you're looking at an eye chart like this. And so you could just sort of make out the top letter in the eye chart there at the level of legal blindness. So looking across a lot of different techniques, a lot of different ways of providing vision, what we have here starting at the top is the epiretinal implant, the Argus 2, then the subretinal implant, the IMS, the Dobell cortical implant, current research on stem cell treatments, then the voice, which I've been talking about, and the brain port, which is the tongue device unit that I showed you earlier. And what's interesting to note is that so far in terms of the behavioral performance of people, a number of the implants are only getting down to, in the cortical place, 20/1200. In terms of the subretinal one, 20/546. Brain port getting you down to like 20, about over 4,000. That might improve in the next test that they're going to be publishing. And with the voice, we're able to get people down to 20/400 if they're naive users, so just with simple training and how it works. And in another paper, they found with trained congenitally blind users, they could get them down to 20/200. So being able to sort of make out the top letter on an eye chart with it. And certainly also, as Daniel mentioned, the price matters as well. So for people who don't have over $100,000 to spare, something like the voice, which could just use a mobile phone, is certainly more accessible. Though it obviously takes a much greater leap of faith, I think, for people to use. Just to show you some examples from our work, one thing Daniel was bringing up was the amount of information you have, how many pixels you can use to represent information, like as a circle. And so we've examined some issues like that. And sort of like vision, you'll see if you get down to about 8x8, you can still sort of make out what things look like. And at 4x4, you can't really at all, as Daniel mentioned. And similarly, with this graph on the right side here, you'll see that the 3 bars representing these higher numbers of pixels are all well above chance performance. And again, these are with naive users listening to the sound of the voice. But when you get down to 4x4, people are sort of responding at chance, just like they would with vision, really. Here's just an example of a person who trained using it for a week, looking for an object on a table. As you can see that, like in Maylab experiments, we do things very simply. So it's not a crowded table, so the person's not looking for a Beck's beer amongst other bottles over there on the table or something like that. But is able to do so very accurately. Here's another naive user, only spent about 20 minutes learning to use the voice, trying to walk down a corridor in which we told him we placed a chair that he had to try and avoid. And also he wanted to try and avoid running to the walls or anything like that as well. Again, to try and give us some insights into how people can use this to know what things are, but also where things are, and being able to use it for action as they move around through the world. And what's really interesting is that we're using a lot of this work to sort of rewrite textbooks on what we know about the neural basis for processing all this information. And this comes from a meta-analysis that put together a lot of studies that looked at how we localize things in space, recognize objects, and detect motion across touch, sound, and vision in people who are blind and people who are sighted. And one of the most interesting things is you'll see in all these images that these dots closely overlap in most of them. And this suggests that the brain seems to be more interested in what it's doing with information rather than how it's getting the information. And so just as a bigger example, to bring across the idea, well, how do we see? Why do these hacks work? And well, do we see with the eyes? No. The eyes are just a sensor. They're providing environmental information to us. We're actually seeing with the brain. And so in some work I carried out looking at how people learn to recognize objects with the voice, when we scanned them with fMRI at the beginning, before they knew how to interpret the sounds, all you see is extensive activation at the sides of the brain, so the temporal lobe in primary and secondary auditory areas. But after 3 weeks of training, we still see that activation because they're still hearing sounds, but what you start to see is activation in visual cortex in the back of the head. So they're not just processing them as sounds anymore as such, but they're actually starting to see with that information, in the sense the brain's processing all those sounds in this visual spatial manner and actually using the parts of the brain developed for vision to interpret the information. And so ultimately, although textbooks normally divide up the brain into these different sensory areas, so you have visual processing at the back, auditory processing at the side, we're starting to think that it's better to think of the brain as a computational device. And so one of the popular names for it in the literature is the metamodal hypothesis. So we're going beyond our sensory modalities and thinking about what the different regions of the brain process in terms of the types of information or the types of problems they solve. And so the visual areas might be very good for spatial information, and the auditory areas might be very good for temporal information. And indeed, other studies have found that if you carefully analyze brain activity during a timing task, even if it's a visual timing task, you'll see areas of the auditory cortex light up. And if you give someone a spatial task, even in sound, you'll see areas of the visual cortex lighting up. So I have a bunch more information available on my website, which is at the top here, Dr. Peter Meyer's website, seeingwithsound.com. Been some different articles in the media, one about 1.5 years ago in The Observer about our work. But also, if you have an Android device, we are in the Google campus, right? You can download the app for free for your device. It also has a Windows program, which you also can download for free. And pretty soon, my lab's developed a training game app to try and make the learning part more fun. And hopefully we're going to launch that soon after we get our initial studies finished. So thank you very much for your attention.